There is another way where you can put two separate colors and then put water in the middle and just kind of mix the middle a little bit. I don't have room for that, but that's okay. I also want to talk a little bit about layering, which y'all saw me do last week, so it's good that we're already kind of there. Layering is very, very important in watercolor. I'm going to do two different types of layering here. I probably should have done this bigger, but that's okay. We're going to let these dry as well. It's pretty much the same layering, but it's the difference between wet on wet layering versus wet on dry layering. Just kind of like what we did with blending here. I'm just going to put WW or WD for wet on dry, WW for wet on wet, and then WW with mix, where you just mixed it right on the paper. In terms of layering, I'm going to do a wet on wet layer, where you can see two wet on wet layers on top of each other. And then I'm going to do a wet on dry layer, where it's a wet on dry on top of a wet on wet. And hopefully we have enough room for washes, which is pretty nice. I'm gonna wait for those to dry. While we're there, or while we're here, I'm going to go ahead and paint the areas where I put masking fluid, and hopefully I put on enough masking fluid. I think I did. So one thing that is suggested about masking fluid is that you should do it by 24 hours. You want to remove it within 24 hours. I don't always do that. I waited like a week or two and I could still remove it, but you do run the risk of the masking fluid completely sticking to your paper if it's too thickly laid on. I'm gonna let that dry. Make sure you let your area dry all the way, because you don't want to push the wet area into the masking fluid area. While we are waiting for layering to dry, I'm going to go ahead and talk about removal techniques. Removal techniques are always super fun. One is going to be with paper towel, one of my favorites. This one's going to be with a brush. You could use anything. As long as it's absorbent, you can use clothing, you can use sponges to get some interesting textures. Be creative with it. As of right now, all I have are brushes and paper towels. And then we're also going to do we're going to do brush instant and brush after a couple minutes. Right? Because when you decide to do removal also affects how it's going to look. Another factor is also wet on wet, wet on dry removal. If you do wet on wet, you'll have more white spaces because you're going to have a layer of water underneath your painted layer. It's going to take a little bit longer for the water or for the colors to really set in. Whereas wet on dry, there's a higher chance that the paper will be tinted a little bit, right? I didn't even put any water down. I was too excited. These flat brushes are really nice for laying water down. They're called wash brushes or flat brushes. It really depends. The bigger it is, the more washy it is. This is also why we have 3 cups. Because your water will get tinted like mine because working quick. I should have done blue for this, but I guess we're going to have a green sky. One of the most popular ways to use paper towel is for skies and clouds. I love doing clouds. They're so fun. And it's pretty easy once you kind of think of the shape of a cloud. One thing to also consider are the different edges. There are hard edges and soft edges. And I think good clouds have a mixture of both. But we can talk about that when we do landscapes. You can see I'm kind of using some of the techniques I'm about to talk about. I wish I had fresher paint here. We'll mix a little bit of blue in there. Get some fresher paint. There we go. So, I'm going to do brush instant right now, where I take a dry brush and I push the belly of my brush right into it to pick up those areas. But as you can see, if you're doing it right away, the water is just going to go right back into it. But it's a really good way to pick up a lot of moisture. It's a really good way to lighten up certain areas. The bigger the brush, the more of an effect you're going to have. Oh, that was full of water. So right there, how I just used my wash brush, just picked that right up. But since it's so wet, it's going to leave some nice soft edges.
So I find when I do that, it seems like it gets overworked.
You think so? I think it really depends on how dry your brush is. So like when I just like that.
So like decisive one swipe with the dry brush, you get a better impact.
Paper towel, I always try to form it kind of like that, kind of roundish, at least when I'm doing clouds, you know. You can do it however you want. Just really push it in. Oh, we got a little bit in the brush instant. That's okay. That's a really good way to create textured clouds. Right. And for one thing, I like to use this to kind of go back to create some softer edges because it still has a little bit of moisture. And if you use the really dry absorbent part, that's when you're going to create like a nice hard edge kind of area, right? So the areas with moisture to help soften areas, and then the hard edge areas to really pick up and create that nice going on there.
Be good for mountains too then.
It could be good for mountains too, yeah.
Yeah.
If you're trying to create like mountaintops. Again, neat trick to figure out if something is dry or not is to put your hand, the back of your hand on it. If it's nice and cool, that means there's still moisture in it. If it feels relatively room temp, it has dried. So I'm just going to do wet on dry layering over here. I'm going to pick up some of this stuff. One, it's going to darken your tones because you're adding a second layer of your color to it.
Is that the same color paint?
Ish, yeah.
Did you say that was wet on dry or dry on wet?
Wet on dry layering. And it's just going to have that nice hard edge. So if you want a nice hard edge, wet on dry. And that can just be said for any wet on dry stuff, is it's going to create a hard edge. Maybe we can do a different color for this one over here. Experiment with color layering. You could get a nice green by doing wet on dry. Why not? Let's try that. Do a little bit of yellow on top of this blue. Then wet on wet layering is how I do faces, and or just an object that looks like it has lots of color. Like if I were to do a peach, I would do yellow first and then the red as the second layer. So it's a good way to layer colors on top of each other. You'll also know if something is completely dry is if you add water. It might look like the colors are moving. If the colors are moving, your layer's not dry yet. If it seems like the water's just sitting on top of your layer, then it should be dry. I don't expect that to be completely dry. For the sake of demonstration timing. Throw some yellow, this blue.
It's a softer edge bleed.
Mm-hmm. Now this is the moment where if you feel like you want to move some stuff around, just clean your brush a little bit, push things around. If I'm moving colors, I like to use the tip of my brush. If I'm picking colors up, which I'm about to do right now over here, I might have waited maybe too long, I use the belly of the brush. So here's what it's looking like after a couple minutes. Way different than here. Even then, I'm still getting some kind of hard edges because I'm lifting up a lot of moisture here. But you can also go back, clean those edges up if you don't like them so jagged. Compared to this soft lift right when I put it down, you know?
Some Kenny Loggins?
In person, though.
Are they doing
Last week
karaoke
they had the,
Thursdays?
Was that
The
right?
Detroit Symphony here, you couldn't even hear them up here.
Another thing you can do is, I should put water down first.
You weren't serious about karaoke, were you?
Me?
They,
What's
are they
karaoke?
playing are they doing karaoke?
They do karaoke here sometimes, yeah.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, I think, because that's not Kenny.
No, it sounds like a women's voice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Women can do karaoke.
Wow, look at this dinner on the
Women can
show.
do Ken.
But she sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
One thing you can do is, while it's still pretty fresh, just throw some water in some areas. But be careful with that, because you can see it's going to push the paint. But that is one way to lighten it up, is to throw in some water and then soak it right up like that. You do
That's
run the
kinda pretty.
you do run the risk of it cauliflowering, if you heard that term. The reason is these little branches, they might push excess paint to the edge of the water, and it creates a nice hard line around it that kind of looks like a cauliflower. There are also special things that you can do, special properties that you can do.